Evening to you all, wherever you're joining us from. Welcome to today's webinar hosted by the United States Study Centre. I'm Tom Corbin. I'm a research fellow in the Foreign Policy and Defence program here, and I'm delighted to have this opportunity to speak with Mr. Kevin Wolf. Before I give Kevin his due introduction, I would briefly like to acknowledge that this meeting, at least where we are broadcasting from, is being held on the traditional lands of the Gadigal people. I'd like to pay my respect to elders, both past and present, and extend that respect to Indigenous peoples the world over. A brief word on the Study Centre. If you're not familiar with the United States Study Centre at the University of Sydney, we are a university-based research centre dedicated to the study of the United States-Australia relationship, but also the Indo-Pacific more broadly. Our mission is to draw insights from tangible value for Australian policymakers, businesses, scholars, students, and the general public, generated through independent, nonpartisan, and rigorous research. The Centre's Economic Security and Emerging Technology programs, who are bringing you this webinar today, in fact, focus on issues of particular salience to the contemporary US-Australia relationship, including supply chain security, international trade regulations, emerging technology policy, and export controls, which is what we are largely here to speak about today. Indeed, export controls and investment screening are taking center stage in the United States and the United States-Australia relationship, particularly with the advent of the second Trump administration and Washington's attempts to protect military and industrial advantages against Chinese, Russian, Iranian, and further industrial espionage, while simultaneously exploiting commercial opportunities for high-tech industries and expanding tech collaboration with allies and partners like Australia. Within that complex policy context, the United States, the United Kingdom, and Australia are naturally seeking greater harmonisation of their national export control systems to unlock new defence and technology trade opportunities. And we certainly saw some significant progress under the Biden administration, if not in the years before that. But there are obviously a lot of questions now with the second Donald Trump administration, not just about where AUKUS writ large will go, but where these more functional, tangible questions of export controls and technology collaboration may land us. And I can't think of many better people, in fact, to give us a bit of an inside baseball on where things currently stand in the United States than Mr. Kevin Wolf, who I'm delighted to have here today. Kevin is a partner at Aiken Gump, a leading international law firm with more than 900 lawyers and offices throughout the US, Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. He has over 30 years of experience providing advice and counseling regarding laws, regulations, policies, what have you, pertaining to export controls, sanctions, national security reviews of foreign direct investments, and other international trade issues. Kevin also served as Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Export Administration in the Bureau of Industry and Security, that's the BIS, between 2010 and 2017 under the Obama administrations. Kevin, before I invite you to give us some opening remarks, I might just request that the audience, if you do have questions that you would like to pose to Kevin, there will be about 10 to 15 minutes at the end of this webinar for me to prompt those questions to Kevin. So please put those in the chat function and I will do my best to get to your questions as and when I can. That's enough from me. Kevin, over to you.
Yeah.
How are things going in Washington?
Somewhat chaotic. It's for someone like me who has served in government and cares deeply about the topics that you could think of, to have our government vote against the UN resolution condemning the Russian invasion of Ukraine yesterday is somewhat difficult to accept. There are some very strange things happening throughout the government, which makes having confidence in not just trade policy, but any policy difficult. So, but to nonetheless try to keep it as level as possible, the way to think about trade topic in this amount of time with this group is to sort of think about three main clumps of policies. You've got traditional old-fashioned export controls, which the US and Australia have been the leaders in regulating the items necessary for the development, production, or use of conventional weapons or weapons of mass destruction for decades. And those four multilateral regimes that identify those items, they still exist, but they're severely weakened by the fact that 3 of the 4 of them have Russia as a member. And for decisions to occur, consensus is required. The one where Russia is not a member is the Australia group, the group that manages chemical biological weapons. And that has been moving along quite well and functional. And so that's something to look forward to. What's happened really in the last few years is because of the sort of breakdown in the regime system, and that the contemporary national security threats don't really reflect the missions of the four regimes, specifically with respect to China and Russia. What has happened is four ad hoc multilateral arrangements have developed during the Biden administration, in addition to the four multilateral regimes. And one is clearly AUKUS, which I'll make some comments on in a moment. Second is the group of 38 countries, of which the US and Australia are charter members, imposing controls against Russia for its invasion of Ukraine. And then something that informally is referred to as Wassenaar -1, or Consensus -1, which are a subgroup of one of the four regimes, the Wassenaar Arrangement, that because Russia is blocking progress, have come together and used their unilateral authorities to impose controls that in a normal year would have been agreed to by all 43 Wassenaar members. And this last year was done for the first time involving quantum computers, some semiconductor production equipment, and additive manufacturing technology. And then the third sort of ad hoc plurilateral arrangement to address contemporary issues with respect to China is the arrangements between Japan, the US, and the Netherlands, who are the primary manufacturers of semiconductor production equipment. And the reason that fourth was relevant is that as complex and detailed and novel as the Biden administration controls were, that you probably hear about quite a bit, although very complex from a lawyer's perspective, from a policy perspective, they're actually quite simple in their objective, which is, by whatever means, to cut off the flow of the inputs, whether services or US origin or foreign origin, listed or unlisted, of the things and the capabilities that enhance China's ability to produce indigenously advanced node integrated circuits, supercomputers, semiconductor production equipment, and the compute side of artificial intelligence. And this is the GPUs and the high bandwidth memory that are needed for data centers. And so for all of the last 3 years of the Biden administration changes, that was the focus of the dual use controls, cutting off and coming up with ever more complex rules to cut off the flow. With respect to AUKUS, that was also a major victory in terms of clever and forward-looking policy thinking. And if you know me, you know that for 7 years of my life, when I was in the Obama administration, it was focused on moving about 80% of the types of items that were subject to the jurisdiction of the ITAR, the International Traffic in Arms Regulations, uniquely military items, from the State Department's jurisdiction to the Commerce Department's jurisdiction. And the reason for that is that our authority at Commerce allowed for large license exceptions for whole countries. And my mandate when I was in government was make defense trade with close allies, obviously such as Australia, easier. And there's a statutory prohibition that prohibits the State Department from creating exceptions, other than for Canada, in its regulations. And so that's why we had to jump through all these hoops to move items over to the commerce regulations and create license exceptions for trade by and among between 36, now 37 countries of most of the parts and components that go into military equipment. And by all indications, that's a major success. It reduced massive licensing burden. It reduced delays, enhanced for interoperability. It's a policy that for the bilateral and relationships with the other of the close allies was really quite successful. But it wasn't enough for two very, very special allies, Australia and the UK, with respect to the more sensitive and the most sensitive defense articles and missile technology controlled items. And I gave to Australia this list of, I solved 80% of your problems, and instead of saying thank you, they said, where's the other 20%? No, there was a lot of gratitude. But it was also from the US side and the UK side, there was a great deal of lobbying about what about the remaining 20%? And what about all those other dual use controls that still require licenses for trade by and between Australia and the UK? And so in April of last year, the Commerce Department just simply removed all controls on trade, on license trade with Australia and the UK, with limited exceptions involving guns and some items for human rights issues. and cluster munitions, and oddly enough, horses by sea, which is very strange. It's left over from the 1970s. Anyway, but the other 99% of all the trade with Australia on the commerce side, it became wildly simple. No more exceptions, no more certifications, no more forms, no more reporting, no more anything. Just the controls disappeared, just gone. Again, by and among between Australia, the UK, and implicitly Canada and the United States. It's really no more complicated than sending something to Montana on the commerce side. And I can't go into much more detail because it's really that simple and that radical of a change. On the State Department side, on the sensitive military items, there was a lot of anxiety within the national security establishment, notwithstanding Australia and the UK obviously being close allies. How could we really have confidence that even for them, it wouldn't be retransferred on to third countries? What about all the dual nationals that are in Australia? What about in the UK, the fact that there are all these cooperative programs with other European and other countries where, you know, the defense industry in the UK is not explicit, is only UK. But notwithstanding that, Congress, to its credit, led, by the way, from the right wing of the Republican Party, which wanted even more aggressive decontrols, changed the statute, allowing for country group exceptions for Australia and the UK on certain conditions. And the conditions were that the Australians and the Brits have comparable export control systems in terms of dealing with dual nationals and dealing with re-exports. And there was you have to be registered. You have to, going through the paperwork so that the governments know who's actually having access and using this exemption. And it could only be within and by and among and between those three countries. And then there was a long list of what are called the excluded technologies list, which is somewhat complicated, of things that still require a license for trade. So I would be curious when you get to the questions, you all tell me from the Australian side, because that's the whole point, is to reduce burden and complexity, how it's working. I still speak with my friends at the State Department who used to work for me, and they're always looking for practical suggestions to make ITAR work. Now, that flowed from what you all know as Pillar 1 and Pillar 2, and Pillar 2 was supposed to be about enhancing joint development in hypersonics and quantum computers and other emerging technologies. What's sort of happened is that sort of bilateral joint development activity is sort of frozen because there isn't real industry support. There isn't support for it. People aren't doing as much as I can tell, into just a straight up ITAR exemption, which used to be called Pillar 2, but really has sort of evolved into something completely on its own. With respect to trade, then another topic that you're going to be hearing about is Trump's tariffs. And so he doesn't care about anything that I just said, he personally. He doesn't speak about it during the first administration, didn't care about it. All he cares about is whether the US is being treated as a sucker, where some other country is getting an advantage, and whether stuff is being made in the US. And he's got one concern, which are trade deficits of manufacturing in the US, which relate to one another, and one tool, which is imposing tariffs in order to threaten other countries to buy more of US stuff, manufacture more in the United States, or resolve other grievances involving completely unrelated issues. And so with respect to the first topics that I mentioned on all the new controls on AI and supercomputers, et cetera, and all the China-specific controls and the AUKUS topic, no one has any real idea what Trump's going to do, including all the people that work for him. So if you look at who's coming into the government, they're extremely hawkish people. If you read what they wrote before they joined the government, whether they were on the China Select Committee, the person who's going to take over my old job, or in think tanks or from others, they're pretty much decouplers. They're pretty much just, there's nothing we can trust about trade with China, either from a national security perspective, because any commercial technology of any sort is going to be used to modernize their military, and it's going to create supply chain insecurities by being dependent upon China, and you can't trust any statements that Chinese make because of their state security laws. So therefore, we should just simply cut off all trade with China. Trump, that's not likely going to be what he would agree to personally. And what he will use is all of these different levers that I just referred to, including the outbound and inbound investment controls, which I'll get to in a minute, as really chits to be traded as part of some grand bargain, some grand deal, which everybody assumes is coming at some point this year or next, but literally no one has any idea what's going on. So anyway, that's sort of I didn't keep track of time. What is it? 15 minutes summary of the status and development of U.S. export control law and policy. You want me to stop there and turn over to you, Tom, to do your bit and then ask questions, or how would you like to proceed?
If you'd like to make any further points in 2 or 3 minutes, then please go ahead. But I do have a list of questions here.
Yeah, the other topic is at the end of the January 1st, for the first time, outbound investment controls were imposed, which basically dovetail with the export controls on, guess what, AI, quantum supercomputers, advanced node semiconductors, and semiconductor production equipment. So if you really want to know what the US identified as the core national security threats beyond those items that are identified in the regime list and that are traditional dual use or military items, it's anything that goes into, again, development or production of AI, supercomputers, advanced node semiconductors, or semiconductor production equipment. So not only are there export controls, there are prohibitions on investing in the development of those technologies in China or by companies in China, or that are owned or headquartered in China. The other thing that the Biden administration did in its last days is it went way beyond everything that I've just described, and it published something called and this is going to be the biggest first topic of the Trump administration on export controls, is what to do with the AI diffusion rule. And that rule, published on January 15th, just days before the end of the Biden administration, literally imposed global controls over every transaction involving every person in every country for any reason, anywhere, from over graphic processing units, the NVIDIA GPUs, and large language models that are considered frontier AI models, 10 to the 26, or which there aren't that many that exist yet. So the bigger impact is on the billions and hundreds of billions of dollars of GPUs that are used in data centers, and frankly also other applications that aren't data centers that are all over the planet. And so based on a policy view that the ability to do advanced AI, all of which depends upon the use of these advanced GPUs, is as sensitive as nuclear weapons, the Biden administration concluded we need to regulate the entire planet. Now, they created, and by regulate, I mean literally every transaction between anybody for any reason, one Australian company to another Australian company across the street, carrying a chip across the street, is literally a controlled event, requiring either a license or the use of a license exception. So for lawyers, this is great because everybody's going to need my time and attention, and the billable work is going to be amazing. Regulating the entire planet, but it's a massive imposition of a regulatory burden. And Australia was one of the 18 countries that receives special treatment under one of the exceptions called AIA, Authorization Artificial Intelligence, but it still requires compliance hoops and burdens to jump through in order to move around any of these NVIDIA GPUs. The Biden team gave a 120-day delayed compliance date running until May 15th. And so the Trump team really just this last week, who read it for the first time, I think, and their reaction was, wow, this is really complicated. We need to come up with a way to simplify it. So the current activity now in Washington is how to simplify this rule. There was no mandate, there was no mission, there was no direction. There was in this rule, there are, for example, country caps. There are limits on the number of GPUs that can be sent to specific countries. There are requirements that anybody that operates a data center keep a certain percentage of their computing power back in the US or inside of one of these 18 countries. So if an Australian data center is going to receive any of these NVIDIA GPUs, it has to agree to not allow more than 25% of its processing power to exist outside of the group of 18 countries, and no more than 7% of its computing power in any one country, which is a significant limitation, and it's an element of industrial policy of basically keeping all the advanced AI capabilities within the US in a very small group of very close allies. And how much of that survives this Trump review, no one knows, because they don't even know what their mission is or their objective. So not only is there, and this is somebody who follows all of this very closely, and I'm not just saying I don't know because I haven't been paying attention or didn't do my homework, no one knows. So the lesson from my talk is on tariffs, complete uncertainty which way it's going to go. The variables are based on sort of personal, grievances that he might have against a particular country, which I don't think he has any against Australia. You're not Canada, where there was, if you've been following the beef and the, stupid stuff about making Canada the 51st state regularly, you're not seeing any of that with respect to Australia. You don't have a trade deficit, which makes you unique, and he sees everything through deficits or not. But we don't know in this sort of transactional style what will happen. And the same thing with respect to the AI diffusion rule, how radically different it will be. It's likely that all the other stuff, and this will be my last comment, about sort of the day-to-day aspects of export controls with respect to China will become wildly more aggressive. And what I mean by that is, if you listen to the Trump people that were coming into the administration before, their main complaint is that the Biden team, although did a great job of imposing radical and aggressive new controls and creative controls, they took too much of what they call informally a whack-a-mole strategy. It's sanctioning this company or listing this tool with this capability or controlling this chip with this particular processing power. And the primary beef of the Trump people coming in is stop spending so much time on all these detailed distinctions and just regulate all chips and all tools and all companies and prohibit it generally, as opposed to being so precise in creating these complex rules. So we'll see. It's going to be an amazingly uncertain time throughout the next year. And anyway, that's the status of U.S. export control policy.
Kevin, that's fantastic. Thanks so much for that opening spiel. I'm looking forward personally to when you are, by extension, single-handedly governing global AI. But in the meantime, before then, I would like to get into some questions. Before I do, can I just remind everybody who's tuned in that if you have a question of your own, you are welcome to pose it in the Q&A or the chat function as part of this webinar. Kevin, I would love to ask you about the finer points of export controls with respect to transferring horses by sea. But I fear that that may be beyond the scope of today's webinar. We can talk about that offline, perhaps. I mean, one of the points you've made a couple of times throughout your remarks just now is that we don't really know where President Trump or his administration are going to go on some of these export control issues. But I'm wondering if there are any lessons that you see that we can draw from Trump's first term. Naturally, you can't simply look at what happened between 2017 and 2020 and say it's going to happen exactly the same way. But are there any indicators in your mind for how things might go based on that first term?
Yeah, there are some lessons learned. So the Biden team, as with Obama in my day, after a little bit of thought for the first year, came up with a very coherent mission, policy, objective, and that governed everything they did for the remaining 3 years. So you could always know what was going to happen. The details were to be worked out, but the objective of the Biden team, again, was to cut off the inputs for indigenous development or production in China of those 4 technologies. The Obama administration was to make defense trade with allies easy. From the first Trump term, it's who knew? Every day it was something different. They would throw around words. Economic security is national security. Civil military fusion was used in every sentence. Then you had the whole sort of Huawei issue of a whole different policy objective of trying to regulate or destroy economically a company because of the opportunity it would have to exfiltrate technology given its tentacles into the 5G ecosystem of the whole planet. That was a whole different policy thread. And it was all over the map. And so you couldn't, everybody was guessing. And then the other thing is the willingness at the time or the threat to use export controls to achieve objectives different than the traditional national security objectives of regulating transfer. So one, uncertainty, which I already talked about. 2, this transactional approach of I could easily see, for example, let's use Australia as a random hypothetical. Let's say you didn't agree to stop the export of X or Y to China, something that was really important to you. It wasn't on any of the control list. You didn't see a national security justification. The Biden team would have said, we tried, you're our ally, we did our best, but that's just what happens with allies. You don't get everything you want. The Trump team, I would bet, would impose tariffs on Australia until it complied. The Trump team, I bet, would impose sanctions on companies that would legally sell to China things that U.S. companies could not. And so again, the Trump team would say, okay, you are not going to stop your controls on X or Y to China. We're going to not sell you submarines. And, you know, two completely unrelated policy topics, even with close allies, willing to use that leverage to extort compliance. And it's a wildly different mindset and disrespect and disregard for the allies and seeing things in transactional terms. That's clearly a lesson learned from the first term. And then all you got to do is look to some of the things that, you know, Vice President Vance said and what Trump have said in Europe with respect to their disregard for NATO and the alliance and beating up the allies on their spending of 2% for NATO. And then, of course, coming out clearly on the side of Russia with respect to the war. You know, the attitude towards allies is going to be wildly different than any other administration going back to before George Washington. So then the other sort of lesson learned from a practitioner's perspective is that the people coming into the government are not experts at the day-to-day of export controls or tariffs or any of the other areas. But on the export control side, the people coming in, they're nice enough people, but none of them have ever worked in this area. The new undersecretary for BIS has never done any export control work, neither is the secretary. We can't all be export control experts, but the undersecretary, the guy who's directly involved, is a tariff guy, and that reflects a focus on using BIS war for tariffs. The other thing that I think you'll see is the impact of all the firings that have been happening. There have been mass layoffs throughout the government through NIST, which is the National Institute of Science and Technology, and other of the technology agencies in the US government, like the National Science Foundation, you know, 10, 20% sort of arbitrary layoffs, particularly of all the new people, which are generally the smartest coming in with PhDs or whatever. There have been, I don't know the exact number, but it's something like 30,000 government employees who've just been arbitrarily fired the last week. And the same thing is happening in BIS. All of the top leaders, all of the top senior executive service people who were there, well, last week are not there this week. And so you're going to have new people coming in, and maybe with no background in any of this, in a complex area with an uncertain president who will give uncertain responses. So regulatory compliance for the lawyers on the phone and the in-house people is going to become very, very difficult, because the people in charge will not have precise, clear answers or even policy instructions. So those are some of the lessons learned from the first term. Sorry.
Yeah, fantastic. There's a lot there. I think you more or less answered my next question, but it did have to do with whether or not we could expect the Trump administration to make wider demands of Australia or the United Kingdom or other allies in that respect, with respect to maybe a wider suite of industrial security measures. And export controls are obviously an important piece of that, but they are only one piece of that broader industrial security mechanism.
Yeah, so possibly. Again, you in the UK, which are in much better position than I think any other two allies. But if for whatever reason, culturally, he's not been beating up on the UK or Australia for anything. He doesn't have a beef with your leaders like he does with Trudeau, or have some other ambitions or issue or fentanyl or some other topic or immigration, which doesn't trigger him coming from Australia or the UK. So the odds that the Australia and the UK would be the victim or on the receiving end of tariff threats is relatively low, just in the abstract. With respect to the export control topics and the high-tech topics, it's probably going to continue on being focused on those four technology sectors plus biotech generally as being a point of leverage that they would assert over allies to say, stop being dependent upon production in China, stop being a supplier of the inputs for producing those four technologies plus biotech, and if you don't, we will impose sanctions. With respect to the ITAR and commerce exemptions, I would bet those are locked in and change, and they're going to be leaving that to a guy named Michael Vaccaro, who is the Deputy Assistant Secretary at DDTC, Directorate of Defense Trade Controls, who used to work for me at Commerce and is a great guy. I suspect they're just going to leave him alone and let him work out the details of making the ITAR exemption more efficient and effective. So to the extent it's not working, let Mike know. He's coming to Australia in a month, I think. And I don't think you're going to see any, that's not gotten the attention of any of the politicals. It doesn't involve immigration or some of the other topics. To the extent that he would assert leverage over you or any other ally, it would be with respect to something involving China, I suspect. Since you're not, in one of those four main technology sectors like other countries, you may just sort of not be within the scope of his wrath, I suspect. But we'll see. It could change from one day to the next.
Yeah, it's hard to know exactly what will be in the news headlines tomorrow. Kevin, you've given us a little bit of insight into some of the folks who have been appointed to the Department of Commerce. I mean, we've had Jeffrey Kessler nominated to be the Undersecretary. We've had Landon Hyde nominated to be the Assistant Secretary. I'm wondering if you are at all familiar with the folks who have been nominated for the kind of the like, well, not for like, but similar positions in the State Department.
Yeah,
You mentioned Michael Vaccaro already.
he's career, but
Yeah.
so on the dual use side, as a guy named, well, first on Landon Hyde, let me talk about Landon. Landon has been nominated for my job, Assistant Secretary, which handles policy and licensing on the dual use side. And he's very young, nice guy. He's also a fellow University of Missouri graduate. What are the odds two of us would make it out of Missouri and end up at BIS? He comes from the China Select Committee with the China-focused and technology-focused background, not as a lawyer, not as a practitioner, but as a policy guy. And all you have to do, if you want to know what his position is going to be, is to read the China Select Committee recommendations, which are all online, which involve damn near decoupling, focused on cutting off all trade in dual use items with China. That would be one of the recommendations in terms of sanctions against particular entities, not just listing the named company, but all their affiliates and parents and subs. So he's got a fairly expansive policy objective for export controls if you read, and he did most of the writing. There's a guy named Jacob Hellberg who's going to be the Undersecretary for the economic group over at State, and several other people that are coming from the China Commission, or he came from the another China-focused committee that are going to State. All of them are decouplers. And then the Secretary of State has been probably the most aggressive China hawk in the whole of the US government. And every time BIS would publish a rule of any sort, very aggressive, very forward-leaning, very controlling of China, whatever it was, he would criticize it and say it didn't go far enough. And all of export control policy is a function of four agency consensus: state, commerce, defense, and energy. And my suspicion is, given all the people that are going to states who have similar backgrounds and know each other in this space, the State Department will carry a lot of weight with respect to setting dual-use export control policy on China going forward. In the Biden administration, the National Security Council asserted great weight in terms of its vision that I described earlier, and Commerce and the other agencies just implemented. But my prediction is it will be state. Now, none of those people have been confirmed yet, and there aren't yet nominees, I think, for the defense trade side, what's called political military affairs. So I don't really know. But again, my prediction is, given the very Republican support for AUKUS, I can't imagine that would be anything that's going to be on the chopping block or even considered beyond saying, please go fix it and make it work, Mike. So.
Oh, that's reassuring. Look, I've got a couple of questions coming in now, so I might start feeding them to you, Kevin. We have one here from Patrick Fazone. Can you provide any background on the AUKUS exemption for missile technologies? You and I had a brief conversation yesterday about the MTCR, and my colleague rather, Chris Watterson, who's on the line as well, had some questions for you about where that is standing. But do you have any insights on how that is shaping up?
Yeah, it's pretty simple. For the EAR, it's gone. For the ITAR, it remains licenses. So what I mean by that is, so the four regimes, the way the US implemented it is it's split out different things that were on each of the regime lists, some of the ITAR, some of the EAR. And so most of Cat 2 stuff moved on the MTCR over to the Commerce Department regulations. And with the April rule, all of those MT controls and every other control, national security, regional stability, et cetera, were just simply removed. No exemptions, no conditions, no limitations, no reporting, just simply a removal of a licensing requirement. So that's how and that was really surprising, frankly, to me, because within the MTCR, there is a long-standing culture of not creating exemptions for your close allies. Because if the US starts creating exemptions for MT items for its close allies, then the other members, which we do care about what they do, Russians and others, will start creating exemptions for their friends. And then pretty soon the whole system breaks down. And so there's been this thread of people at the State Department, who's now Pam Durham, who leads the missile tech group. And they've been keepers of the flame at preserving worldwide licensing requirements for missile technology control regime items. For the ITAR, in recognition of that, they did something different. They didn't create exemptions for MT. The very first item, in fact, listed on the excluded technologies list, just simply says MTCR articles, with one small exception, and directly related data and services. So all MT items that are on, whether Cat 1 or Cat 2, that are on the US munitions list, noted by a little MT after the entry, still require a license for trade with Australia and the UK. Which would seem to sort of undercut sort of the policy objectives of Pillar 2, but it was really a recognition of that broader philosophy towards preserving the integrity of the MT. That said, what State wrote in its rules is that for any of these things that still require a license on the excluded technologies list, they'll get expedited treatment. And if there's a government program involved, they'll finish it within 30 days. And that's just, so that's the regulatory answer. What I don't know, what you all have to tell me, is as a practical matter, does that actually work? And I don't know the answer to that question, whether you're really getting expedited treatment or with the conditions or provisos or the usual back and forth in drafting, it's still problematic. So I don't have any insight on that. But anyway, does that answer your question, whoever asked it, in terms of what the structure is on the MT controls?
Yeah, I think that was fantastic. I have another question here. I'm not sure who it's from because it came in before the webinar began. When do export controls become too controlling? Or maybe there's another way to phrase this, which is, where do the limits of export control reach or regulation lie? You spoke in your opening remarks about this attempt to govern kind of the spread of particular items, particularly relating to AI, kind of at a global scale. But just how enforceable is that in your professional opinion?
Yeah, no, great question. There's an inverse relationship between the extraterritorial application of US controls and their enforceability. You know, when the system was created decades ago, you had a thing that went in a box, a landing gear for aircraft. Customs would open it up, look in it. Is it for a military aircraft or a civil aircraft? And, you know, far more enforceable. I exaggerate for the sake of humor. Now we have literally global controls run out of little tiny BIS on the third floor of the Commerce Department, the entire planet's transaction, with only 6 export compliance officers outside the United States. And so the answer to that question that a government official would tell you is, well, we realize we can't staple an enforcement official to every transaction, but we're creating systems where it makes it easier for either the hyperscalers like Microsoft and Amazon and Google to be able to send where they want, or data centers in Saudi Arabia or Kuwait or Malaysia or other places that are building out data centers, that you can get, if you're one of these parties, authorizations, which are very vast and very broad and very simple, on the condition that you agree to regulate how those chips are used, and most importantly, who has access to them. And the primary condition on these authorizations is that no Chinese companies or companies that are headquartered in China, or companies that have an ultimate parent in China, wherever they are on the planet, or even Chinese nationals logging in from any country or any company, regardless of their relationship to China, have access to these data centers, which are used to run the models to create the sensitive AI algorithms. And so the regulation comes from a combination of capturing lots of the trade inside these big authorizations, where trusted parties are going to be given general authorizations, and they will self-regulate and have audit requirements and reporting requirements. So that's that. And then also, it's with GPUs, it's not like a commodity product. Sure, there's going to be diversion that occurs, but the demand is far higher than the supply for the A100s and the Blackwells and all these other advanced GPUs that are going into data centers. And that, you know, the data centers are sucking them up for their own use. and the odds of diversion are far lower than sort of basic semiconductors that you have the issue on with respect to diversion to Russia. And then next, the number of players in the ecosystem, in the large quantities that really matter, even though each individual chip is controlled, it's really the large volumes that matter, what you need for scaling up with AI applications. They will inevitably rat one another out if they start seeing, non-compliance by others, because they have customers that said, "Oh, we went to this other data center and they said we could have all the access we wanted, even to our Chinese customers. Why can't you?" And what those companies are going to do is going to disclose. So it is the case that you're not going to have traditional enforcement of tracking down diversion. You are inevitably going to have lots of, suitcase-sized shipments of chips going from Malaysia into China. And you can buy in a market. That's all inevitably going to happen. But I don't think it really matters all that much, because unlike with, a bomb or a gun or a weapon where the individual item has sort of inherent properties that are of concern, for the AI objective, which is regulating the general application of AI, you need thousands and thousands and thousands of chips in this really unusual situation where there are these amazingly small choke points, and that you've only got one company on the planet that's making all the chips, TSMC, and essentially only one company, which has 90% of the market or whatever it is, NVIDIA, which is designing all the GPUs. Now that is going to change with AMD or Intel or others. And then the US government isn't really too concerned about clamping down too hard and thus provoking an alternative source, because with the controls on the shipment of semiconductor production equipment to China, both from the Netherlands and the United States, it's going to be impossible for Chinese fabs to have the capability to start building their own advanced chips. They have their own tool companies, of course, but they're decades behind in many of the capabilities. And the scaling that's needed that TSMC has, it's only a fraction of that at SMIC, which is the main Chinese fab. So I think the government answer to your question about enforceability is a combination of all those sort of factors which are unique and novel to GPUs in the AI ecosystem. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's fantastic. Thank you, Kevin. I think we got time for one more question before we have to wrap up. Kevin, you're down here in Australia, courtesy of the State Department. I should have said at the outset, thank you very much, State Department, for facilitating Kevin's visit. We're off to Canberra later this week to hopefully give you some greater insight into how the Australian ecosystem is looking at AUKUS and the AUKUS exemption. But I'm wondering if for our Australian listeners on the line, you could give us a sense of how US industry is viewing the AUKUS exemption. Is it a useful mechanism? Is it a game changer in the same way as it's been presented down here as in Australia? Or is it a slightly different perspective?
Yeah, it depends upon the company. So I've got clients who are small companies they make 5 widgets. And if their 5 widgets are not on the excluded technologies list, this is very simple for them. They just put it in a box and send it to Australia or the UK, just like Canada. It's very simple, great, almost no regulatory burden. And for that universe of countries, it's a complete victory. Same thing with any leftover commerce controlled items. It's no different than sending something to Montana. It's very, very simple for them. For the large, the 6 or 7 main primes, where any one shipment will have a complex collection of different items or as part of a broader program, they're pretty much back to where they were before. I'll just get, a manufacturing license agreement for production or services overseas, or the DSP5s for shipments, because it's too difficult to go through and sort out, which items are or not on the excluded technologies list. And on the UK, it's a little bit more complicated, less so in Australia, because so many of the UK companies are sort of so blended in with the other EU country or with EU countries that you don't have exclusively UK end user. Whereas with Australia, it's actually easier, because more often than not, you don't have that sort of interdependent structure. You've got a lot of standalone sovereign Australian companies, and so it's simpler that way. So unfortunately, it just depends upon the company and the product mix. And there, by the way, the conservative Republicans who pushed AUKUS don't like that excluded technologies list or the limitation on MT items. And so there was a great deal of push to remove all of the excluded technologies list by some on the right. And so we'll see if that push picks up again, now that group has such large, is the majority in the Senate Armed Services Committee, Foreign Affairs Committee. that is the committee of jurisdiction for this. It was Democrats who said, we like what you're doing at AUKUS, but there have to be some limits, and they were a little bit more cautious about complete decontrols. So we'll see if somebody picks this up and lobbies it and runs with it, what will happen, but I think you'd have a receptive audience.
Yeah, fantastic. Kevin, this has been excellent. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise and your insights with myself and with the group. I would encourage everybody on the line, if you haven't already, to go and look at some of Kevin's recent analysis with his colleagues at AUKUS on some of the early signs on export controls from the Trump administration. There's a very neat summary there of some of the remarks he gave today. I'd also encourage you to go and check out the US Study Center's work on export controls. Shameless plug, particularly a report from myself and Dr. William Greenwald of the American Enterprise Institute on the AUKUS exemption and the defense trade control harmonization efforts that came out in August last year. But with that, Kevin, thank you very much again. Thank you everybody for tuning in, and please be sure to tune into future USSC webinars. Thank you very much.